Gravel suspension, what is worth it and what isn't? We've got everything from forks, suspension, built into the frame, bolt-on parts. Some things are fantastic, some things are not. What is fantastic is we have the tech maestro himself, James Huang, in here to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of gravel suspension. How are you, sir? Good to see you.
Pretty good, Ben. I've actually never been in the little cave here.
Welcome to my humble abode.
Where the magic happens.
Still waiting on the magic, but something happens in here. So today we're going to go through the different types of things: forks, stems, seat posts, what we like, what we don't like. We may or may not agree. If you don't know who James is, you've been living under a rock. James is the tech editor for years and years, Cycling News, Bike Radar, Cycling Tips, Escape Collective, and is now doing his own thing in -1. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Substack newsletter.
Yep.
Just read the Microshift Sword review and more to come. So yes, click below to get in on James's newest thing. For forks, we've got like a 40 to 60 mil. Like paint us a picture of like the overall landscape.
Well, I feel like before we get into the specifics of like what the actual bits are, I think like, do you want to maybe talk about whether or not suspension for gravel actually makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's the whole underlying thing. Like why should we even delve into this or not? What is your take? Are you a pro suspension or an anti-suspension?
I guess the answer is probably what I would say to a lot of things. It depends.
Yep.
Because I say a lot that gravel is sort of like this one descriptor that we use in the industry for like this huge breadth of types of riding that people do. And it goes everywhere from like smooth dirt roads to like pretty chunky single track, like, you know, what a lot of people like to call underbiking. And I think within that, it really does depend like what sort of riding you do, what your terrain looks like. And around here, we've got all of it. And for a lot of the smooth dirt roads that we have, I usually don't go with suspension because you don't really need it. Something like even like a 32 mil tire for a lot of stuff around here is totally fine. Like I remember when I did the Moods Ranch Rally a couple years ago, I did that on like a 35 mil semi-slick gravel tire, and it was awesome. But then like this is my personal bike behind here. I've got 47 mil tires on there right now with a kind of a bendy seat post and a suspension fork on there. And for the type of stuff that I ride this bike on, it's great. But it really just depends on sort of what your terrain looks like and what your goals are, I think. Overall, though, I would say I'm a pretty big fan of suspension on gravel to some degree. It just depends on how much you actually need and why.
In the it depends category, I mean, that's always the first answer to most everything. And someone's like, how are we rating something as good? Is it more comfortable? Is it more faster? You know, is it lightness? Like what are the parameters? And then that, of course, depends on who you are, how you like to ride. Bike industry will often swerve towards like what's the performance benefit, like what's the raciest thing, and I think there's a pro and a con argument, or pro and con arguments there as far as like maintaining forward momentum.
I think a lot of those things are interrelated though, because let's say we were looking at the performance aspect of things, right? If your goal is to go faster, one of the ways to go faster is, one, to keep your tire contact patches on the ground more consistently. And another way to go faster is to not be bouncing around so much so that you can keep putting power down. So for smoother terrain, then I don't think suspension is all that necessary. A bigger tire usually will do the trick. But otherwise, if you have some measure of suspension, then it does let you be more comfortable, but it also lets you have more control, and it does let you just keep power on the ground, and it keeps you fresher at the end of a long day. So I kind of think they're kind of the same thing for a lot of people.
I like the feel half the time, with the half being like the downhill parts. Like that gravel suspension makes me feel more in control and more comfortable, and ultimately faster if my eyeballs aren't getting rattled around. And like I said, the tires are staying more on the ground than off of it. The more it goes up and the steeper it goes up, the more poopy pants attitude I have about it. Like most dramatically, not that this was a cutting edge gravel suspension performance bike, but I rode a 2001 giant Protege at Steamboat Gravel this year. Yes, exactly.
Oh, I have that bike. That's right.
Our buddy
I want to know about the background of that bet, by the way. You can tell me later.
Yeah, our buddy Nathan Forbes at Schwalbe and I made a bet. I lost the bet, so I rode a bike of his choosing, which was this thing, and he was just dying laughing. He liked the idea of it of this, and his original pick was a Trek Y-frame.
Oh,
Similar thing of just undamped suspension that just moves for days. He bought one of those on the Facebook Marketplace. It was cracked. The frame was cracked, so he had to start over. So he got this bike. Anyhow, on the flats of Steamboat, which as you just illustrated, you can ride on a 32 tire and generally be good to go on most places. On the flats, it was mostly fine. Like you could feel a little extra weight. On downhills, felt fantastic. I was just riding along with like the little tassels flying.
I mean, you looked happy, man.
I was happy. I enjoyed the hell out of that. That was probably one of the most fun gravel experiences I've ever had, like as far as being in an event, because it was the objective was fun and I achieved that thoroughly. Going uphill, it wasn't just the suspension, but with the coil spring and
the fact that it was like 40 pounds.
Yeah, the bike was like about 40 pounds. That did not go faster uphill. Very slow. I didn't need a stopwatch to measure that. And just standing up, this sensation felt ridiculous. It was like some of the very early, in fact, was some of the very early full suspension things, like undamped boingy suspension. It just, even if you take out the efficiency measurements, it just doesn't feel good. It feels like you're doing this instead of doing that. And that's kind of where I net out with some other gravel suspension, and that just from a gut feel, like when I stand up, it feels squishy, and I'm just accustomed to a stiffer leverage thing. So even if it's demonstrably slower, I'm sorry, even if like a rigid is demonstrably slower than suspension, like it just gets in my head that it just, the feel is a little different. So sort of like a super squishy saddle, like comfort here, that it's just like just the perception, too squishy.
Well, I mean, we talked a little bit about whether or not suspension makes sense for people riding gravel in general. Couple of things we haven't really talked about are sort of how much suspension makes the most sense for people if they're interested in it. But the other thing that we can talk about right now is the idea that no matter how much suspension you have, I've always been a big proponent of however much suspension you have, it's super important to have it tuned properly. So that giant Protege, for example.
It had one tune setting, as it was.
I'm going to make the blanket assumption that the suspension on that probably wasn't tuned very well.
No, and there was really no way to tune it aside from just like making sure it was bolted on.
Yep.
There was no adjustment. Just that obviously like far extreme example.
Yeah, because for better elements of suspension, you can adjust your spring rate, you can adjust your spring progression. You have some most of the time, for at least the longer travel stuff, you have some semblance of like adjustable oil damping. So you have all these parameters that you can tune so that it doesn't necessarily feel squishy, but still works on the stuff when you hit it, or it can be sensitive on washboard or not super sensitive on washboard, or tuned for bigger stuff, so on and so forth. So there's all this stuff that you can do, but it's pretty important to do it too. Like, for example, like this is a Redshift shock stop stem. I've used these for a long time, and these don't give you a whole lot. They're 20 mils supposedly at the hoods of up and down motion, and everything is controlled just with like these little elastomer blocks. So not very complex, but even with something as simple as that, I've always found it super important to tune the elastomer hardnesses to how you want it to feel, because otherwise it can either be super, super soft or just not work very well. But when you hit that sweet spot, I've been really pretty happy with it.
Speaking of different conditions, I think a lot of us ride gravel bikes on pavement and then on dirt roads all the way up to trail. And for pavement, I want the thing to be rigid. And thank you for bringing all these props.
I brought
Cane Creek's EE Silk, similar in ways to the Redshift, in that you've got the elastomer damping, but then you've got a wee switch here I think conceptually this is cool, but then you get into the aesthetics of like,
Oh, it's ugly.
I want
I can go ahead and I can comfortably say that this little nubbin on the top here is not aesthetically pleasing.
yeah, just like with lockouts on forks, if there's a big cable, like I like the idea of just being able to switch it off, but then I don't like all the fangled stuff and that just like more things that can potentially go wrong. We talked on stems a bit. Let's jump into forks as far as like what the range of options are in terms of travel and cost and weight, and which bikes you can put them on or not put them on, or what happens if you put on a suspension fork to a non-suspension corrected geo.
There are quite a bunch of options out of the market now. This one here is a SR Suntour GVX, but RockShox has the Rudy, Fox has the 32 taper cast. You've got King Creek has their
the invert.
The invert, yes.
Yep.
Totally blanked on the name for a second there. And then Cannondale has had their fork and stuff too. So there are quite a few options out there, and they differ quite a bit in different characteristics and parameters and stuff. But for the most part, what you're looking at in terms of travel, they usually range around 40 or 50 millimeters, so it's not a lot.
Yeah.
And then as far as whether or not any of them will fit on your bike, the biggest thing is typically what they call a crown to axle length, basically just the tip or the distance from the base of the headset to the center of the axle. And ideally you want to have a frame that accounts for that longer fork, because most bikes that aren't meant for suspension will just have a shorter fork.
Yeah.
And that's not something that is, it's not necessarily like a total deal breaker. Like you could put a suspension fork on a bike that's not meant for it, but it'll probably mess up with the handling and the fit a little bit, so it's not ideal.
Yeah, it's going to bring the front,
kind of has that like
up.
the chopper effect a little bit.
So you've got like a taller stack.
Yeah, and the head tube slackens out.
Yeah, yeah. So you're going from like 400-ish to like 440-ish as far as like your axle, the crown.
Like that.
So like yay, and then if you count for sag, it's not that much, but
it's enough.
Small
it's enough to be noticeable. I feel like.
Yeah. The back gets like the MRP Baxter is probably the tallest. It's like they have a 40 and then they've got a 60.
Oh my God, I don't remember.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And then you got like the Lauf, which is the spring.
Oh, I should have brought that too. I forgot that one.
Yeah.
Fail.
Like an OG gravel.
Yeah.
Like, but speaking of things like tuning or not tuning, Lauf, there's no tuning.
There is no tuning from how you get it, and they do offer different stiffnesses in their little carbon fiber leaf spring thing.
Yeah.
But you have to buy the right one.
Yeah.
But anyway, as far as adjustments go, like this fork here, you've got an air spring on top here, so you can adjust the air pressure and therefore the spring rate and to some degree the spring curve. Although for 40, 50 millimeters of travel, it's not really that big of a deal. Again, like how much that changes the ride, I think is pretty dramatic. It really can be the difference between something that just feels pretty crummy to one that you don't really notice all that much.
Where I really appreciate gravel suspension, be it a fork or a stem, is in the saddle. So not like big hits. I'm not hucking things. Occasionally I huck myself. I haven't found good suspension for that.
I don't think that would have helped you on that one.
But just in the saddle, of just like the annoying like,
washboard especially.
Like you can like going from a rigid bike, even with fat tires set low, to something with a bit of suspension can make a tremendous difference. That's where I'm a believer in gravel suspension.
Yep.
And then you get off that, and I stand up, and I'm like, oh, it's too squishy. I hate this.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's not for everybody. I feel like there's a reason why you see so few people who are focused on gravel racing running suspension.
Yeah.
Because when you're really on it, like you really don't want to feel that squishiness, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, kind of like what you were saying earlier, even if it's, it could feel slower, but then it could be measurably faster. It's sort of like when you look back at the days, like early days of Paris-Roubaix and stuff like that. People were really resistant to running really big tires and like really soft pressures to some degree. Let me back up. At a place like Roubaix, like that was kind of more the norm, but people were resistant to dropping pressures on the road because we were. How many years did you and I run like 110, 120 psi or whatever in our tires?
Sure.
And like it seemed like that was faster, but we know now that that's actually slower.
Yeah, and they're like sometimes what feels fast can be counterintuitive. Like sitting in a go-kart just a few inches off the ground, that feels very fast, and then you get in a very nice luxury car or an airplane, and it can feel very smooth. But yeah. Forks cost in the range, like I think the cheapest I've seen is State. The Arizona company has a 40 mil fork for like $500, but usually they're like the $900 to $1,100. And then there's a few bikes that come with a suspension fork built in.
You can get them. You can get them on their stock. There's certainly lots of RockShox and Fox forks that are spec stock on a bunch of gravel bikes out there. I'm kind of the opinion that for gravel suspension, I kind of prefer to go either light and simple and relatively inexpensive, or like the other extreme. Because like I said, like that, I really like the Redshift and the Cane Creek stems actually, just for how simple and relatively light and unobtrusive they are. But for bigger stuff, I really do like the nicer forks for the level of tuning that they provide, because they really do feel better. It's really nice to have all those damping adjustments and just the way you can just get it to feel exactly how you want it to. When you're stuck in the middle, you just can't, you still have all of the weight and then some, because even the nicer suspension forks, you're adding a pound. And then the cheaper suspension forks, you're adding even more than that. And then at that point, like, you have some ability to really cushion your body from particularly the bigger impacts for the suspension forks. Ironically, I find the stems to actually work better on like little chatter than a lot of the forks do. But for the forks, if it's not a good fork and you're kind of like lugging everything around for not as much benefit, I'm not a huge fan of those.
So you said this is your personal bike and you picked the Fox because that is best in class, or that what you got a good deal on?
I mean, a little of both, I guess. I mean, the thing that I love about this particular fork is it has all the damping adjustments that I want. I mean, part of that is you kind of have to know what you want to do with those adjustments, but if you know how you want everything to feel, and you kind of know what damper settings you can change to get to that point, then you can kind of set it however you want.
Have you ridden the Cane Creek invert?
I have.
Yeah.
It was an earlier production version though, so like supposedly they've made some changes from what I rode to now, but yeah, I've definitely ridden that one. I
rode one at Sea Otter for like half hour or whatever, went out on a lap and bottomed it out so hard I thought I had broken something. So I need to get one
more air
in. More. Well, I mean, they set it up for my weight, but
again, that's another thing. Like you can set things based on your baseline weight setting, but like you run a longer and more aggressive position than most people on gravel, so you probably have more of a forward weight bias than most average gravel riders would. So that would play into account. If you hit stuff harder, then that would also play into account. If you just want things to feel firmer, that would play into it too. So like if I were to set you up on that fork, and that Cane Creek fork, it's worth mentioning, doesn't have any damping, so it's just spring. So like for you, I would definitely run more air, but I don't know if that would be a good idea for like a good pick for the sort of riding that you want to do, because if you're running a lot of air, then at that point, like you're also having to deal with a pretty strong rebound speed.
Yes.
So like maybe that would be good for you, maybe you wouldn't. I mean, I guess you would have to let me know.
Yeah. No, I like your thought on if you're going to do suspension, you might as well have nice suspension.
Yeah, either do it or don't do it.
Meh suspension. So for Mabel, one of my two dogs, is weighing in with her thoughts on gravel suspension also.
She's not a fan.
If snacks aren't involved, not into it.
What if the fork covered in beef juice? Does that make it better?
Could. So if you had your pick of forks, it would be Fox 32.
I think for what I use this particular bike for, which is a lot of dumb stuff that I probably shouldn't be riding a gravel bike on in general, this fork has been great. But for day-to-day stuff around for where we are, where it's a lot of like pretty fast, relatively smooth, unpaved roads, then I oftentimes just run the stem with some slightly, well, I shouldn't even really say slightly bigger tires. Like I'm perfectly happy with 40s around here, or even 35s on a lot of stuff. And that suspension stem does great.
As far as bikes that I've ridden, for the most part, gravel bikes with a front fork, I haven't been super pleased with. just like looking at the totality of it. So like the Giant Revolt X, for instance. Giant Revolt, love that bike. Revolt X, do not love that at all.
I almost feel they went too far into the mountain bike territory on that bike to some degree. Like it's kind of slow and lumbery, and
that's how it felt. And some of that could be the tires. I can't remember if it was 45 or 50, but like just really heavy rubber.
They're big. Yeah,
and just like it felt like a lot to lug, but without a super plush ride. It was like definitely more cozy than rigid, but like didn't like that so much. I rode a Stigmata with, I can't remember if it was a Fox or Rock Shocks.
I think I can't remember what the Spectre stuff is, so I'm not going to say.
I feel like it might be Rock Shocks. I have to check that later. Loved how that felt. And it felt still light and lively. It had a bit of a mullet tire setup, like a 45 front, 40 rear Rambler, so not super light, but like...
See, it depends.
It depends. And yeah, I love that thing. And a few people are like, oh, I thought you hated gravel suspension bikes. I'm like, well, normally, yes, but this one feels great. And like, looking at the numbers, I couldn't tease out exactly why.
Yeah.
But it was just a feeling thing. Like it still felt nimble and like it wanted to go, but I could take bad lines and it would soak it up. So that to me was a bit of a revelation. That's one of the few bikes with forks. I've been like, that's fun.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we haven't really talked about is sort of the idea of just kind of the concept of suspension in general, that it doesn't necessarily have to be this thing that you bolt on, because, you know, for ever and ever, we've always had this thing, you know, called compliance, right? Like frame compliance, forks and seat posts, whatever. And for the most part, especially when carbon fiber frames and components started really becoming super common, you know, early on, we basically just called them, you know, black aluminum, because they were just aluminum parts in carbon. But as people have figured out how to exploit carbon fiber's characteristics and, you know, make them flexy in one direction and stiff in others and that sort of thing, I can't think of anyone at this point that makes carbon fiber, I guess, drop bar road gravel stuff, where they specifically want it to be like iron girder rigid, like so maybe like a track bike or something. And so, you know, the one thing that I often say to people who are super down on even the idea of suspension is sort of letting them know that a lot of times they already have it to some degree. You just don't see stuff moving.
Yep. Case in point, I go back to Giant Revolt. I love how that post has a bit of give.
It works. It's noticeable.
It doesn't look like this. There's no moving parts, but the post as a whole moves, and unlike this, which could probably break a window,
self-defense mechanism right there.
Yeah, it's not super heavy. So that's often kind of where I net out, is for most riding that I do, dirt roads, just having suspension in the tires and in the post and then a bit of the elbows. Usually that feels enough for me.
Yeah. Speaking of tires, one thing that we haven't talked about at all is sort of just, you know, you often get this, I keep a straight face.
What's a good tire? Yes, a lot of suspension comes from the tires. James brought in
I brought a prop.
He brought in his favorite gravel tire.
So
I think.
So yeah, tires. A lot of times people will say, like, you know, can't you just run more tire? You already have a 45, 40, you know, sometimes 50 mil gravel tire that people are running now. Like, isn't that enough suspension? And like, it very well might be. It oftentimes is.
Keegan's racing on 2.1s, 2.2s.
I know. It's the thing now. But again, for good reason. And the reason why he's doing that is, again, because he's realized that having that sort of being able to essentially just level out the ground makes it faster. He can go faster because he's not bouncing around so much, because the terrain that he's riding on now essentially is smoother than what someone's riding on with like a 40. And to some extent, that's definitely true. But, you know, my argument is always, if that were the case, we would still be riding mountain bikes that are fully rigid. Like, tires absolutely help. Mabel, that definitely helps. Tires absolutely help for 100%. Like, you've got these big pillows of air that you're riding on. But again, there are limitations there, because it's just a big pillow of air, right? So it's uncontrolled to a certain extent, undamped. You have to tune your rolling resistance and your pinch flat resistance and your grip. Like, there's all these different parameters that you're trying to dial in with tire pressure. So you can't really choose to optimize one without necessarily compromising some of the other ones. Because if you wanted more suspension on a gravel bike and you just, we're looking to just do it with tires, then
Show them your favorite tire.
this one would work just fine. Like this is what I run. This is what I run on my fat bike, and that's a 27.5 by 4.5, and
It
probably
weighs as much as this fork does.
it might be more actually. But yeah, that gives you plenty of footprint and cushioning and stuff like that. But it's also really bouncy and undamped, and like I use that in the winter for riding on snow, and that's a situation where it's like, we're adjusting pressures like quarter, half psi to kind of just get things dialed in on the conditions, and you just can't really get everything exactly where you want it in terms of just one parameter with the tire. So like at that point, like there are other things that come into play if you want things to feel exactly one way.
Yeah, it's also weight, and then for many folks, it's a frame clearance issue
Sure.
too. So even if you did want to put a fat tire, fat bike tire in your gravel bike, that's not happening.
Yep.
Jumping around back to stems. Another stem-ish like solution is the Future Shock, specialized built-in stem that, whereas these will move like so, that moves up and down.
Yep. Which is definitely better.
I love and hate that, just like I kind of love and hate this. I love how that feels, and that the angle of your wrist and the angle of the bars doesn't change at all. That feels to me more natural, whereas this, at least until you get used to it, it kind of feels like you're sort of diving over the front. Downside is those things need maintenance.
They need
pretty
maintenance.
regular. Like
they're heavy, the stack height's super
things
high.
Get loose, and you can't just, unlike these, you can't just bolt them onto pretty much any bike. Like it's specialized, specific. But if you have one of those, let me know your thoughts. You love it, not like it, halfway in between. I'm with you with it. Of these, like I'm gonna put a Redshift, I think I've got one in here, on a bike just to take some of the chatter off.
Especially with your busted wing there, buddy.
That's, yeah, that's exactly why. Just for the normal riding that I would normally do on a gravel bike or even a road bike on dirt, just to have a little of that smoothed out with a minimum of fuss and a minimum of cost. So I feel like, kind of like you were saying, if you're gonna go full suspension, go all in, but then these are like $100-ish or something like this.
Yeah, I can't remember. They're like, less than 200.
Yeah, and goes on just like a normal stem.
Yeah.
Spend a little time taste testing different elastomers, and then just set it and forget it.
Yeah, I've swapped elastomers out on the trail, so like it's definitely, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I've definitely done it out there before.
Yeah. The simplicity is appealing to a simple-minded person like myself too.
It's super simple. There's no maintenance. There's nothing to do once you get it installed and set. Like you're just done.
Yeah. Let's talk posts. You've got a whole smorgasbord.
I do. I got a whole bunch of different ones here. Seat posts are interesting. Mainly because your saddle is where you are, like it's your foundation for power output, right? Like you don't really want it to move that much, but at the same time, it's also where you derive most of your comfort on a bike. So like you were talking earlier about that giant revolt and the way that D-shaped seat post actually really does work. Like it definitely flexes a lot, and it seems like they tuned that pretty well for at least kind of riders of average weight to flex enough but not too much. And that's generally what I go for with suspension posts for the most part. Like this one, most of them, again, like I was talking about tuning earlier, most of them are tunable to some degree, whether like changing springs or elastomer stacks or adjusting preload, that sort of thing. And I oftentimes adjust these to be fairly firm because, again, I just don't want it to move that much. Like I feel like for a lot of the chattery stuff, like a little bit of tire squish and a little bit of frame flex, a lot of that handles that pretty well. But it's mostly like, you're riding and, sometimes you can hit something that you don't see, or like you kind of just want to be able to just fully charge through some section that's super chunky. Then a lot of times for me, I feel like if I'm running one of those posts, then that lets me do that. Like I can basically just dive in and not really care too much, but I can just keep the power down and go faster.
Also, sometimes climbing stuff, it's better to have.
Kind of bouncy.
Yeah.
They can be anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So we got I thought this canyon post was going to be like the ergon post you have on your bike of the two.
How many of those things do you think I have, Ben?
Oodles. I've been in your garage. I know what it looks like. You probably have more. You probably have literally more than you know in your garage there. So what does this post do? This is just a rigid post.
This is an older post that Canyon made a while ago. I actually don't even know if they still make this at all. I guess mainly because they don't actually do very many bikes with round seat posts anymore. But this was a seat post that they made with carbon fiber and basalt fiber, I think it was. And they just made it so that it was super flexible without having to resort to like a parallelogram two-piece thing like that old ergon / Canyon post. So Canyon does still make those leaf spring seat posts that they include in some bikes. And those actually work pretty well too. I like those a lot.
And there's like a little initial setup to get the two pieces where you want them in your saddle angle. But once you've done that, then that's a set it and forget it.
Yep.
Maybe not quite as light as just a traditional post, but pretty darn close.
Yeah, you're looking at a weight penalty of like 50 grams or something. It's almost nothing.
Yeah. And the ergon, I have vague memories on this like I do most things. The ergon and Canyon, they're brothers?
Yep, the heads of both companies are brothers.
Yes, okay.
Yep. Frank and Roman.
So they can share a post design.
Yep.
Yeah. What else are we leaving out here? We've done forks, we've done stems, we've done posts, we've done tires. How about frames that have a bit of squish built in? I think back to the world's first gravel full suspension bike, the Niner
MCR.
Magic Carpet Ride. I rode a trail a couple days ago that I rode on that bike. Like a dowdy jaw, basically, where going up you kind of have to pick your way through, and then coming down, if you're on a gravel bike, you have to pick your way through, or if you're on a mountain bike, you can just blah, 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 blah. And coming down that on said Magic Carpet Ride, I was like, oh, okay, this is one very, very narrow case where this makes sense, but then the rest, but riding up there is like, oh, this is like heavy and overly squishy.
The thing that's funny about a lot of suspension on gravel is if you look at the design of the components and how everything is set up, it's really, most of them really aren't all that different from what you would find on a mountain bike. So like this
smaller.
For like this suspension, for example, you still have, this aluminum steer tube, you still have this aluminum crown, aluminum upper tubes, this cast magnesium lower, and like you still have the same, like the bill of materials is probably just as long. But the parts
But the travel is not as long.
The travel's shorter, and like the parts are smaller and shorter, but like you don't save that much weight, and that's why a lot of these things aren't that much lighter than mountain bikes. So that's why I say, like, if you're gonna do it, just kind of go all in, because then you're getting as much of the benefit as you can without having to kind of drag all the weight around for nothing. But like, it's funny that Magic Carpet Ride, Niner was almost too early with that, I feel like, because there were a lot of things that maybe could have happened with that frame now that they didn't do back then. Like the geometry was weird, and the rear shock that they stuck on there wasn't great, and like there were definitely things that could have been done. But it rode great, super plush. But one thing that one thing that we haven't touched upon at all, and if we look at the development of gravel stuff as being sort of just however many years behind mountain bike stuff, which is true in a lot of ways, certainly as far as the technology goes. A lot of mountain bike suspension now, you're moving toward pretty advanced electronic suspension, where you've got these variety of sensors and processors and stuff that decide when things should be firm and when they should be soft. And the stuff on the mountain bikes it's amazing. It works now, like they've gone through however many generations at this point, but it does work pretty remarkably well. And when you were talking earlier about ideally you'd want a gravel suspension where it was soft and active when you needed it to be, but when you're kind of out of the saddle and just like really giving it the beans, like you don't want it to move. And you don't want to have to mess with like levers and knobs and all that stuff.
Like reaching down to switch things or even thinking about it all.
But if you didn't have to, that would be kind of cool.
If it just did it for you.
Yeah, so like RockShox has this thing called Flight Attendant. Fox has this thing called Live Valve. And neither of those companies has announced anything at all that they're doing anything like that with gravel, because I just don't really feel like the market's ready for that
Yeah.
for a variety of different reasons. Like, I don't know, do you need that level of suspension for 40, 50 millimeters of travel? Yeah.
Yeah, when within gravel bikes, maybe 1% of bikes out there have
Yeah.
suspension at all.
Yeah.
So like,
But if you strip away the cost, if you strip away the sort of the complexity argument for now, if you just had suspension on your gravel bike that absolutely worked when you needed it to, but was locked out when you didn't want it to move at all, and that all happened automatically,
yeah, sign me up.
it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, the last full suspension gravel bike I had was had V brakes on it. It was a Specialized Epic flat bar gravel bike, mountain bike. It's a mountain bike, but the promise of that initial brain was that it would do just that. It would do the thinking for you. Would you stand up on hard terrain, it's not moving, and hit bumps, it soaks it up. So yeah, I'm sold on that. If you could get that and have it without a weight penalty, I'd be all in. But
And make it cheap too.
This does beg the question: like, if you're going to go all in on gravel suspension, why not just ride a mountain bike?
Yeah, I mean that's there is still I mean that line is definitely getting fuzzier and fuzzier because it's funny. I posted a picture of this thing on my Instagram account, and I had a bunch of buddies who were like, "Just ride a mountain bike, blah blah blah," and like they're all mountain bike guys. And but like one of my buddies, hi Tom, I don't know if you're watching, but one of them
Hopper, which Tom?
Tom Torrance.
Torrance. Oh,
so known him for a long time.
Not Tom.
But he does a lot of rides on his short travel cross country bike, but it's like up 4 Mile, up Logan Mill. So I think it's a lot of dirt roads that honestly a bike like that would be more comfortable and I would argue faster because for sure there is definitely a one end of the gravel bike spectrum that is getting closer and closer to mountain bikes to the point where I like to say that they're like modern gravel bikes are kind of like bad mountain bikes from back in the day. But that's true to some extent, but you do still have the advantage of I think drop bars for longer distance riding they're hugely advantageous. If for no other reason than just like position, especially when you're going at faster speeds, it is just better to be on a drop bar bike.
Yep.
And then they are still generally a little bit lighter, and then the wheels and tires are oftentimes they can be lighter depending on what your setup is. But again, Keegan's running 2 1s, and but again, the drop bars I feel like are a big thing. So is the line getting fuzzy? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Let's just wrap it up with kind of a summation of what we personally like and.
It depends. We're done.
And at the conclusion of this all, I don't know. Pick it out yourself. I guess where I am is just like still on the baby end and the shallow end of the pool of having like a 45-ish tire for chunkier days, maybe 47, 50 if the frame will fit it, and then I'm gonna at long last give one of these a go just because I could use a little cushion right now. The one suspension bike that we've Diverge STR. I have to come back to that. The one maybe like now 2 bikes that I've really appreciated how they feel has been the Stigmata, because it had that best of both worlds. It was still light and lively enough, but soaked up a lot. And then the Diverge STR took a different route.
Very different.
Of
like super niche bike.
Head shock or future shock up front in the head tube that we talked about, but then
like super flexy seat tube thing.
The whole back end of the frame moves with essentially a shock built into the frame. What was your take on that particular?
Amazing
bicycle? On
rough terrain and going downhill.
Yes.
Didn't love it necessarily on stuff where I had to pedal a lot. And that was, to some extent, maybe a condition of tuning. But I think inherently in that design, there's only so much you can do. And there's a reason why they put on the little lockout switch on there.
Yeah, there's 3 different settings that you reach down between your legs and switch it. Yeah.
Because I feel like on that's a bike where you kind of do need to use that a fair bit, depending on the terrain, because it really does move around a lot. If you don't have an absolutely perfect pedal stroke, And if you're on smoother ground, then it does move around more than I would prefer.
Yeah.
But again, for that pointy end of the gravel spectrum where you're mostly riding kind of ugly terrain, or if you just want something that is absolutely super comfy that you can just ride all day and not really worry about it, then I can definitely see the appeal on that. But it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for me personally. But I can see why they've made that bike, and I can see the type of person that it would appeal to.
One of my criticisms of that, in addition to like what you listed of like having to fiddle with it to get it to work well in most situations, was that like the top end bike felt delicious and was 14K. And a lot of people pointed out, well, like everything's 14K now for the top end bikes, but
It doesn't have to be.
But to just kind of lean more into that, if there was that level of functionality and some of like the flight attendant level of built-in brains, that could be incredible.
Sure.
So it'd be a bit hypocritical, like that's too much, it's too complicated. But if it could cost even more because of added complexity that the system itself sorts out, so I can just ride it and it does what I want to without having to switch it, that could, I mean, that's like pie in the sky stuff. And I do appreciate Specialized and Trek and others like just going like whole hog on stuff, even if it is not a good solution and not a feasible thing for most of us. I think it's fun to see brands experiment with stuff, and that's one thing that I'm enjoying about gravel is that there's no yet agreed upon like this is good. Whereas like an aero road bike, like physics is what it is.
Yeah, it's the full-on Wild West right now.
Yeah,
whatever goes.
Yeah,
which is kind of fun actually.
Yeah, I think so. Back to what you like. Tell us one more time about what you have set up for your personal riding as the best according to James Huang. For James
This
Huang.
is definitely a little bit of a Franken bike for sure. It's a Santa Cruz Stigmata frame. I got that mainly because I wanted something with a little bit more mountain bikey geometry. I really like the handling of having that front wheel kind of pushed out further in front of you. It's kind of more forgiving, and when the ground is looser and the traction a little bit less certain, then I personally feel like I can go faster on a bike like this. It's just a little bit more forgiving. Yeah, Fox suspension fork up front, because on a lot of the uglier stuff that I ride around here, it offers really good control. It's not that heavy. I personally don't find it to look all that ugly on a bike like this. It's not too in your face. But then out back, I didn't want to go with a proper suspension post because I don't really want that much movement back there. I went with that older Ergon parallelogram style flexi post that I found to actually work quite well, and then the Specialized 3D printed saddle, which is super squishy. And for me, that's enough. I mean, I spent enough time riding hardtail mountain bikes back in the day that I don't really need that much movement out back for a gravel bike. And then the big thing was the tires. These are actually really old mountain bike tires that I've had for ages. I don't necessarily recommend running tires that are this old, but they're
do as you say, not as you do.
But you know, they're old Schwalbe Furious Freds. They're labeled as 2.0s, but they measure 47 mil wide. They're crazy light. They're like 360 grams. Paper thin casing, super fast tread, super fast, super fun. And the grip is actually okay, surprisingly. But just a lot of cushion and like a lot of speed. And I'm generally pretty easy on my gear, so I don't feel like I need a ton of like a super thick tire necessarily. Although I have flatted twice on these, I will say. But it's been a fun setup. Yeah, I'm running GRX Di2 2x because I still like 2x a lot of the time. I see benefits of both. But yeah, this is sort of my Franken gravel bike.
I dig it. I dig it.
It's been fun.
It's been fun chatting with you. Thanks for coming by the Delaney shed to talk gravel suspension.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Again, James Huang, the Tech Maestro Supreme. I will put a link to his new project N-1 in the description below so you can get on board there. Let us know what questions you have, what we haven't answered here. Let us know your thoughts on gravel suspension, good, bad, or otherwise. And regardless of whether you want suspension or a rigid bike, I absolutely encourage you to go follow this guy because his knowledge will help you to enjoy the ride.